From Flourish DX, this is the Psych, Health and Safety Canada podcast, with workplace mental health becoming a priority for businesses who want to retain staff and prevent burnout. This is the source of information for creating sustainable and psychologically healthy workplaces in Canada.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Flourish DX Psych, Health and Safety Canada podcast. I'm Kim MacDonald, and I'm your host. Today, I'm very excited that we have as a guest today, Dr. Kevin Kelloway, and he is a Tier 1 Canada Research Chair and also a professor at St. Mary's University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. Welcome, Kevin.
Thank you. Pleasure.
So it's my first question is always to have the guest introduce themselves and share a little bit about their background and what led them to do the work that they do. And for you, it's you've been doing the work that you're doing for a long, long time. And that's not to say you're old at all. That is to say only that you have a deep and broad area of research. So if you could share a little bit with our listeners.
Sure. So my background's in organizational psychology, which really it's sort of ironic because I fled to it when I realized I wasn't going to become a clinician.
Okay.
And I had worked as an undergraduate at a psychiatric hospital, which really turned me off anything to do with mental health and mental health treatment.
Okay.
And then some years later, I'm still in my undergraduate, but I ended up working for a company that did EAPs, and especially alcohol and drug-focused EAPs. So I sort of got interested again in issues applied to the workplace. And I remember coming back to Dalhousie in my fourth year, and they asked what I wanted to do my thesis on. And I said I was really interested in this this notion of psychology in the workplace. And their literal answer is, "Oh yeah, we don't do that here." and you should go down. And you should go down to St. Mary's and talk to Vic Catano, which I did, and I ended up doing my master's with Vic, and then here at St. Mary's, and then my PhD at Queen's.
Okay.
And at Queen's, I worked with a guy, Julian Barling, who's a leading researcher in what we now call occupational health psychology. Although I went with him to do something totally different, but just over the years, I got more and more involved in first studying stressors, and then really some things that interested me because of my work background. So I was really interested in violence at work because I worked in a very violent environment. So, and that just progressively led me further down this path.
Wow. So the focus as you go, it was a little swerve. And then what led you what changes have you refined it, or with working with your students, have you broadened it, refined it, or is it all going to stay down the path of, mental health and well-being?
Yeah, I think it's expanded because I say the best part of my job is I get to work with really smart people who are interested in the same things I am, and they come up with great ideas. So as we're studying, the work environment and how that affects individuals, that keeps changing because every new student has new ideas. So we just finished, or I guess we're in the middle of the second round of collecting data now, linking workplace factors to suicidal ideation. And that's it was something I got interested in, but then it was one of my students took it and ran with that. And I think we have some interesting data coming out of there. So that's the great thing about students is they take sort of your core interest and then take it in a slightly different direction.
You mentioned about workplace stressors. So for psychological health and safety, there's the discussions around psychosocial factors.
Right.
So share a little bit about that. What is some of the work that you've done around that? What are the influences, I guess, or the contributors in the workplace?
Yeah, I think at some point, there's this current debate going on about how many psychosocial factors there are and what they are and how they're interconnected. And I think I got away from that in the sense of, I think it depends on how you draw the picture. There's There's a lot of psychosocial factors to focus on. And what I prefer to do now is to go into organizations and find out what the issues are and base any data collection, base any interventions around that, rather than going in with a predefined model that says here's 7 things that we're going to do. Let's see which, and there is a lot of commonality. You see the same things over and over again. Bullying, harassment, incivility is an issue almost everywhere. And whenever it occurs, it's a serious issue. So there is some commonality.
Yeah, which is one of the interesting ones when we think about it just in our ordinary lives, that civility would be such a huge issue and have such a big impact. Well, why do you think that civility in workplaces can have such a negative or hopefully positive impact when it's managed and understood?
So I don't have great data on this, but my personal hunch is I think we're more vulnerable when we're at work. And I think we're more vulnerable because when we go to work, we're sort of giving up some of our autonomy and giving up some of our freedom. And we're agreeing that I'll report to this supervisor and this person gets to tell me what to do. So I think that puts our sense of dignity on the line. And as a result, we're sort of, I think, hypersensitive to threats to our dignity. So when someone is rude to us, or even ambiguously rude, the classic I always use with my students as an example is, 3 or 4 people in the department are going for coffee and they walk right by my door, but they don't invite me.
Yes.
And then, that's the classic incivility. And you sit there and for a lot of people, you sit there wondering, well, what did I do to them? Why are they mad at me?
Yes.
What's going on? And I wouldn't normally be that sensitive to things like that. So I think there's something unique about the work environment that makes us a little more vulnerable. And of course, also, we have to come here every day. So, if somebody is rude to me at a, grocery store or something, I can ignore that because I don't spend a lot of time there anyways. And I can go to another store if it's a real issue for me. But the workplace is someplace I have to come every day.
Yeah. All right.
So I think it might be those 2 things, but it's really, it's really endemic in organizations and some organizations much worse than others. With some very hierarchical organizations. Okay.
So what are some of the impacts of that? And then maybe we'll go back to sort of, I think I led us down to this path. But what is the impact of that then over time, I guess? For some of these?
I think it becomes, a couple of impacts with issues of harassment and incivility in particular. Years ago, researchers articulated this notion of incivility spirals. So I'm uncivil to you, you respond in kind to me, and then I escalate it into aggression and you respond aggressively to me, and we keep upping it until someone intervenes or something bad happens. So I think that's one potential. The more common potential is I think people just fret and they ruminate about it, and it really sort of ruins your work experience because that's what you're thinking about all the time. And of course, if it gets really serious, really intense, then people often leave. And that's what we're seeing in a lot of organizations now, where, when there's not so many jobs, we might be willing to tolerate a little more incivility. And when it's easy to get an alternative, then you say, why would I put up with this?
Mm. Yes. Yeah. So circling back to your, looking at the context, sure. I guess, like you mentioned that as opposed to going in with this is the program, you go in and you want to really understand the context and then focus in on what would work for them. So do you consider culture, sort of the idea of the workplace culture, or
Yeah, I think there's, we always have some sort of generic models. We have models of leadership. Leadership is almost always an issue, but it's how it plays out in a given organization. Years ago, we developed mental health awareness training for leaders. And there's lots of versions of this around, people doing mental health literacy in one form or another. And I think what set us apart, although we had the same generic program everybody else did, we taught people what depression was and anxiety, and we tried to normalize that. But what we did differently is we would say to organizations, we won't even come and do the training until we've audited your procedures.
Oh.
And we would go through their procedures and policies, and
yes.
we would put together a binder for the managers we were training. So when we were saying, for example, this is the stage where you might want to bring in somebody in human resources, we didn't do that generically. We said, you should call Kathy. Here's her number, right? And so we got very specific and locally dependent. So when we talked about absenteeism policies or leave policies, we would talk about their policies. And I think that made the training more useful. We have some data that said the training was successful. We published a couple of papers on it. But I think, for me, that's a big part of it, is that we took that fairly general program, but then customized it to each organization. And in some cases, where a program, for example, they went to mental health programming, but they didn't have an EAP or EFAP, we just said, no, you should spend your money on an EAP, right? Let's not promote awareness until you have the resources in place to help people.
Yeah, I think there is an order. There's some orders of sort of, I guess the highest and best for your context right now.
Yeah, so we just want to make sure the organizations had things in place. So when we're telling, because one of the things we discovered in this training is managers do not want to be counselors. They do not want to be therapists. Frankly, the less they know about your personal life, the better, the happier they are. So they wanted enough to be able to say, look, I know you're having problems. I don't need to know what the problem is, but here's how we're seeing it in the workplace. And did you know we have these resources? And point them to the EFAP, point them to our leave provisions or whatever we have. But that implies that we have those things in place.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's interesting you mentioned about managers and sort of their take on things. Have you seen managers change or leaders change inside workplaces, or maybe whether they've changed or the conditions have changed, I guess?
I think to some extent, yeah. It's certainly organizations as a whole are more open to some aspects of the mental health discussion, and in a way that I haven't seen in 30 years, that organizations are now looking for answers and solutions. And instead of me pounding on the door saying, hey, let me in, they're coming out and saying, hey, we need something in this area. So that I think is a good thing. And for managers, I think it means their life got a little more complex, because now they're dealing with, all kinds of issues that maybe 20 years ago we didn't deal with, or we dealt with inappropriately. So if somebody, I always say to managers, when somebody is in a mental health crisis and they're really struggling, we're probably dealing with that as a discipline issue.
Yeah, so it's a performance issue.
Yeah, because their performance is down, or they're missing a lot of time, and now we're disciplining them, right? Which is not a helpful strategy in this case.
No.
And so we've become a little more aware now, and at least hopefully are having that discussion about, what's the sort of underlying cause of some of these,
what would you
decline in performance.
Say to a manager so that they can become more observant of that, or be able to differentiate, I guess, or I guess, get curious about as soon as a performance, or what they might assume is a performance issue.
So this is work I did with Jen Dimhoff, who's now at the University of Ottawa. And we did a couple of things. So we started doing training managers and just doing, standard sort of mental health literacy. Here are the most common psychological disorders. Here are the prevalence statistics. Here's what it looks like. Here's how it might show up at work. And Jen used to say we did a half-day session, and she said there's two big parts. It's what do you know and where do you go? So the first part is what do you know about mental health issues? And the second part would be what do you do as a manager, and what's the conversation you have, and how do you refer people? And one of the things that came out of that is managers would say, okay, well, that's great. So I know how to refer people now and things like that. How do I know when to have that conversation? Mm-hmm. And that led us to looking at how someone in crisis shows up to work. Now, it could be a mental health crisis, but it could be a lot of other things. It could be your kid got hit by a car and you're worried about your kid. And it could be your marriage is in trouble and mm-hmm. There's that kind of issues going on. So we don't care what kind of crisis is. Just if you're in crisis, what does that look like to an outsider? And we actually came up with a measure we call the Signs of Struggle scale, the SOS. But it looked at those sort of major things like how do you show up to work when you're really struggling with personal issues? And how would someone know? How would a supervisor know that you're in trouble? Well, one thing is when people are in crisis, they talk about it. They talk about wanting to quit. They talk about how stressed they are. They talk about being unable to cope. Sometimes they cry at work. Sometimes they're see, I'm from Cape Breton. I want to say snarky, but
I love the word snarky. Yeah, that's a good word.
So sometimes they're snarky to other people when it's not justified. So that's one thing they do. Another thing they do is withdraw socially. So they don't go to coffee. They don't go to lunch anymore. And if you never did that, that's fine. You're an introvert. We understand that. But if you're someone who used to always go to coffee and all of a sudden you're stopping going, that may be a sign.
So the changes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then it's, your work performance might fall off. You're missing deadlines. You're not doing the same quality work. You may be missing more time, taking more sick days, things like that. And I think fairly, more rarely, but it still happens, is people engage in some extreme behaviors. They might be threatening harm to themselves or others. The most common, I think, is people stop taking care of themselves. Mm-hmm. So they stop showering and changing their clothes. And when we do sessions with managers, I always ask about this. And in any group of managers, easily 75, 80% have had to have that conversation with an employee.
Wow, that's a high percentage.
And I would have never guessed.
No.
And I'm just always amazed at how many managers have had to have that conversation about, sort of hygiene and dress and things like that, and not connecting it to a mental health issue. But if you say to a clinician, hey, I have this employee and, they're not talking to anybody and they just sit in their room and they don't seem to be changing their clothes or showering, they would probably go right to depression as a possible cause of that. So it's not that unusual. But anyways, those sort of behaviors are things that managers can see and gives you the opening to the conversation where you can say, I have noticed this.
I think it's the words, some of those, it's like once you can get into a conversation, you can manage that. But for managers, it's that, what are the words? I've had them ask me those questions. What are the words I say? How do I start that conversation?
Yeah.
And it's walking through that piece of uncomfortableness.
And so we've always encouraged managers to start with, what have you seen? Right? What are the behaviors you've seen? Or, I noticed you're not going to lunch. I noticed this. I noticed that. And that allows you to open the door. And then you say explicitly, I don't need to know what's going on. But what I want you to know is we have this resource, we have that resource. You know, if there is something, then there is help available for you.
I think the explicitness is so important. Like the manager saying that, Kevin, like it's just to be clear, because I think a lot of employees won't know what they, even if they don't want to share, maybe I should share, maybe I shouldn't share. It's just, but then the manager saying, I don't need to know, and there's this. So,
and especially I think when we're under a lot of pressure, we always think we're holding it together. Right? I always say I need my wife to tell me when I'm stressed. Yeah. Because I think I'm doing fine. And she's the one who will point out, yeah, not so much. Right? and you're being really cranky with people and yes, you seem really overworked. And, so she can point things out to me, but again, I think I'm doing okay and nobody sees anything. So I think it helps for managers to open that conversation. It gives them a tool to do it. But it also says to the person, maybe you're not doing so well as you think. Right? And maybe you really are struggling with this.
What do you say to managers who, I guess the employee would be worried that if I share this is going to impact my ability to still be employed at the most extreme, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. So if the employee is not asking for an accommodation, right? If they're asking for accommodation, there is some disclosure required. You can't just say, I want to do this. Usually you have to provide some rationale. But in many cases, the manager doesn't have to know what's going on. Mm-hmm. They just have to be able to say, I've seen a change in your behavior. It's affecting the workplace. And, we have this pile of resources that you might want to look at and see if one of them's going to be able to help you out. And even in some cases, I know this is heresy for many organizations, but sometimes the solution is a short-term leave.
Yes.
And we don't usually encourage employees to take a short-term leave, but taking that leave might be a better thing to do than trying to work through it and have something more serious happen.
So the leader's role in that. So you had, you and I had talked about before this conversation about the role of the leader and the unique role the leader plays in the workplace, or the manager. I guess, do you distinguish between the manager and the leader when you have those?
Not really. When we teach this, my undergrad or master's classes, we always make that distinction and say, this is management, this is leaders. But really, when we look at all of the work we do on leaders, we're interested primarily in those people who hold formal positions, usually a manager position in the organization. Now, we're still interested in their behavior, their leadership style, if you will. And we recognize sort of in the back of our heads, well, everybody can be a leader. But we're really interested in what managers do because they have more power and play a more central role. I'm forgetting who right off the top of my head, but somebody has this image of the leadership spotlight. And the idea is every leader should think of themselves as being on a dark stage with a bright white light shining on them.
Okay.
Because everyone's watching the leaders, right? And everyone's listening to them. Because you're trying to figure out what's going on in the organization and what's appropriate and what's not appropriate and what's my day going to be like. So leaders do have an influence that's sort of unique, and that's really underpinned a lot of my work. I mean, one of the threads running through everything I do is I'm always interested in how leaders have an effect on people's well-being.
Well, interestingly, and I think I mentioned this too when we chatted, which is about the size of the leadership training market in North America and then around the world, $366 billion market. And I was looking at some research the other day, and it's the growth between 2019 to it's sort of like going up now. If we get to 2026 or 2030, that it's going to continue to grow. And yet, so we have this huge training capacity, and yet some of the experiences in workplaces are problematic and difficult. Yeah. So what is it that we haven't figured out, or, between a leader or the manager, and how to translate that? What's been getting in the way, I guess, for the past 10 years? We can go back 10 years.
Yeah, I think you can probably go back a lot further. This has always been a huge market, and every indication is it's going to keep growing. I just saw a survey out of a consulting group where they asked employees what they wanted. And surprisingly, one of the things they wanted more of in terms of leadership development is more sort of instructor-led programs, and less coaching, less mentorship by their own manager, which I think has been, everybody's been thinking it's the other way.
Yeah, right? That's the future, that there's.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. Now, who knows what that means? Maybe they're already getting coaching and mentoring, and they want an add-on to that. Or maybe they're looking for new ideas or new approaches or whatever, which you probably are not going to get from the person you work for. You may get very helpful stuff, but it's stuff you're exposed to anyways. So I'm not quite sure what's going on there. But yeah, big leadership market has always had this problem of transfer, that we send people off to training, they learn new skills, they learn new approaches, and then they come back to work and they either don't try it at all, or they try it out and it falls flat and they give it up quickly.
Yes.
Right? So there's always been this issue. And I think some of that is, frankly, the trainer's fault, because I think sometimes we've approached that by saying, the way you be a good leader is you have to be somebody else.
Yes. Well,
right?
if you look at some of that, over the years, the leadership styles, I think we're sort of taken, it's just my own perspective, taken a little too far in terms of absorbing that, instead of, that it's by route. Yeah. That if you do this, instead of blending it with yourself and figuring out how you can be also. You don't have to be that. You can take that and blend it yourself, and then figure out how to do that. So many leadership styles, Kevin. What's your thought on all of the leadership styles we've, in business management over the years?
I think there's a huge overlap, and there's now some data suggesting that. And, we keep coming up with new leadership models. But as researchers, when we're able to put them all in the same study, you find out they all correlate, 0.9. So they're all really saying the same things. They're just saying it in different ways. So I think that's important. I think it's important that we identify, helpful things for leaders to do. I think it's equally important they all have to find their own way to do it. Mm. And because when we try to be somebody else and we try to mimic somebody else's style, we just come off as awkward and inauthentic. And, at best, our employees just think we're being weird.
And not in a good way.
No. And at worst, they're probably discussing what kind of edibles we had for lunch, because they don't know what we're doing.
Yeah.
So
I know. I think it's almost a disservice to leaders and managers, because there's so much talk about bringing your authentic self to work, and trying to even understand yourself in this context,
right.
Like as a manager. And if you're taking that advice as it's infiltrating workplaces, then how do you do that yourself and still incorporate that?
Yeah. So what we tend to do a lot more of is say, look, here are the general principles, and it's up to you to figure out how to do that. Mm-hmm. So, for example, we have a model, the right model, where we talk about the importance of the R is recognition. And I always say, you want the best leader tip in the world, tell 5 people a day they're doing a good job. And then
it's so explicit and specific.
Yeah. So very behavioral. You figure out the words. I'm not going to give you a script because that's when you're going to come off as weird. And then adjust that to your own personality. If you're really quiet and gruff and have never, ever told anybody they're doing a good job, well, maybe start with 1 person a day, right? You don't have to jump in at 5. And if you're already doing it a bit, then 5's a good goal.
Yes.
If you're already telling 10 people a day, then move on, find something else to add to your repertoire, right?
Go to the other letters.
Yeah. So there is some adjustment and calibration there. But the basic principle, recognition is important. It's going to drive a lot of the behaviors you want to see. It's an important element of creating a psychological safety in the workplace. It's something leaders should need to be doing more of. That's true for everybody. And now our challenge is to figure out how do we do that as individuals. And that, I think, is a better approach than trying to write a script for people to do that. So I'll just give you quickly, because I really like this model. So the R is recognition. The I in right is involvement. And we talk about the importance of getting employees involved in decisions. And again, that can take any format that you're comfortable with and you can enact, but it's really asking people, what do you think we should do? Right? Or if this was your decision, what would you? And we talk about the importance of growth and development. So having those conversations about employees' career path in the organization and what skills they want to develop and things like that. We always talk about the importance of health and safety, even in environments where, people think health and safety, we're talking about, construction sites and things, but there are health and safety issues in an office as well that we need to talk about. And we talk about the importance of leaders building teams. So that's recognition, involvement, growth, occupational health and safety, and then teams. And so we talk to leaders about the importance of doing something in all of those areas on a really regular basis. Some of them might be every day, like recognition and probably involvement. Some are a little more sporadic, like the growth and development conversation. Mm-hmm. Maybe that's once a month, once a quarter or something. You're talking to employees about that. And then taking those general principles so it's weird because they're general principles, but there's very specific behaviors involved. So taking that and just trying to figure out how to apply that in your own words, in your own way. And that to me is the important thing, that if we try to overscript that, people just come off as phony. But asking leaders, how can you do this? Or to think about how can you do this? How would you go about building a more cohesive team? And there's we can give you lots of information on how to do that, but at the end of the day, you have to figure out what you're willing to try.
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the Flourish DX Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all Flourish DX Academy courses included within the Flourish DX mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with Flourish DX for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
So for teams, because a lot of what we do and how we accomplish things are in teams. Even if we're working side by side, we're sometimes in a team and sometimes we're co-creating, but there's all kinds of versions of that, and we can call it a group or we can call it a team. What are some of the most critical things for the leader to be trying to accomplish or achieve in that teaming?
Yeah. So, and in fact, sometimes I always say I recognize when people are working in teams. I've gone into a seminar room at the beginning of class, and there'll be 5 graduate students in there, and they've all got a laptop open, and everyone's busy typing away, and they're not talking to each other or anything. And then later on, I find out they're all working on a project, and they're all simultaneously working on the Google Docs, and so they're working as a team, although they look like 5 individuals isolated. Yeah. And I'm making fun of them for not talking to each other. Yeah. When in fact they're working very productively as a team. So we have to recognize when teams exist.
Yes, and the effectiveness of that, which is, and also, there's joy in that when we're like working together, I think, and productively like that, and getting and accomplishing whatever the goal for each piece is. And
it's just a different format. When I was in grad school, it was 5 of us sitting around talking and exchanging ideas and writing them down. And now they just do that in a different way. So for leaders doing something about teams, I have a couple of favorites. One of mine is always debriefing. I think is one of the best things leaders can do after every project, after every milestone, to take even 5-10 minutes to say, what did we learn from this? What could we do better? What went wrong? What went right? And there's good data on this suggesting the power of that in not only developing the team, but developing the team members' capacity to work with each other. Right?
Can you share a little bit more about that? It works on collective output, I guess, of the team, but also on their capacity.
Yeah, so we get better at doing our tasks just by reflecting on them. But it also triggers, I think, a different mindset. So there's some data in surgical teams that suggests that regular debriefing helps the members of that team work with other teams. So often in surgical teams, they come together for one operation. There's a surgeon and an anesthetist and the OR nurse and whoever else is in that room. And they do the operation as a team, but then they disperse. And the next day for the next operation, it might be a different team, right? So same surgeon, but a different nurse or different anesthetist or whatever. And even under those conditions, taking a couple of minutes after every operation to say what worked, what didn't work, what could we do better, what did we take away from this, actually helps them to work together next time. I think it triggers a learning mindset, so that we're looking for ways to improve. So that, I think, is a valuable thing leaders can do is institute regular debriefings, and I think treating teams as teams, so regular check-in with teams. And dealing with, so academics hate this. So there was a guy, Tuckman, years ago, who wrote about team development, and most people have learned about the norming, forming, storming, norming, performing. That's it. Yeah. And so academics hate that because the model doesn't really work. But what it points to, especially with that storming phase, is almost the inevitability of team conflict.
Yes.
So we put people in teams, they're not always going to get along.
No.
And there's a role for leaders in that. There's a role for leaders in helping team members work through the conflicts. And normalizing that. I know even in the university, we're always surprised. We have programs where we put students in teams, especially in our business schools, and they do a lot of work in teams. And then my colleagues are always, surprised, and we say, "Oh, I'm so sorry, I did this group project because they're all fighting with each other." And if you look at the literature, then you sit there and you say, "Yes, that's the nature of working in teams. That's how that works."
And they're the ones who are writing and doing all the research.
Exactly. Yeah. But we don't think of it, right?
Yeah.
So we always think of when teams are having a conflict, we always think it's a really bad thing. And
yes,
certainly sometimes it can be, and sometimes it's just a normal process of how we figure out how we're going to work together.
What are some of the secrets of then when it comes up for a team or for a leader to help a leader, communicate to the team what this is and how this, I guess maybe there's some advice there.
Yeah. So I always encourage teams, in our programs when we're putting teams together, I always said, so right at the beginning, sit down and figure out a team, how you're going to work together. Right? So is it okay if I call you at 9:00 on Sunday night about the assignment that's due Monday morning? If that's not okay, let's settle that now.
Yes.
Right? And let's all understand our own ground rules because we all have things going on. So let's try to establish a common model of working at the beginning. And that'll help us speed through some of those issues so that we don't have to have a fight every time somebody is texting you at 3 a.m. or something like that.
Yes.
Right?
So taking the time to have that in advance of anything happening.
Yeah. So planning for it and planning for, we recognize as a team there are going to be disagreements. So how are we going to work through those? And what's the model we're going to use? Right? I think that's a useful conversation to have at the beginning.
That's a very useful conversation.
Right. It's not a panacea. It doesn't solve everything. Yeah. There's still going to be bumps and glitches. But a lot of the stuff we end up dealing with can be resolved early on. And there's a role for the leader in that.
Yeah, it's normalizing it. It goes away to recognizing that in advance so it doesn't feel quite as, maybe it's I just think normalizing and accepting that these things might happen. So let's plan for it.
Yeah. And there are some things we know happen that, I always try to point out to our teams. So we know you can get free riders. And I explain what a free rider is, someone not doing the work, they're just hanging around. So I said, well, maybe you have that talk. What are we going to do if someone starts free riding?
I've not heard that expression. That's a good one. And I've been in many teams and I could have used that probably. Yeah.
You'll often get a team member who isn't really participating, isn't really contributing.
Yeah.
And they're just free riding. So we know that happens. It happens commonly. So let's figure out how we're going to deal with that in advance. So I think in general, what I'm saying is that teams have to be a more reflective process. I don't think this is a natural thing for us that we all understand immediately how to work productively with other people. Sometimes we have to think through these issues more explicitly.
Yeah, I don't think we know that intuitively at all.
No, and you think we would, our whole history is one of coming together as groups to accomplish things. But it is something that's a different set of skills.
In the workplace, I guess it's sort of things come together and we're always working so quickly, especially for, as you've referenced, the teams that are not intact and they come together to work on something and then they're going to disperse to the next one. That conversation of debrief and the planning in advance, I think those two, it's almost like the bookends, are really important.
And I always emphasize, because those conversations, this is not a day-long retreat where we're going to, figure out all our issues here.
Yes.
This can be as short as a 10-minute thing, right? This is how we're going to go about this task.
Yeah.
And then afterwards, how did that go for everybody? So it doesn't have to be a big thing. At a lot of workplaces, you'll see a morning huddle where people don't even sit down, right? We're going to get together for 5 minutes just to plan out the next couple of hours.
I had a team member who encouraged me to do that. I loved that. I loved him for it. It was just such a great thing. Let's have standing meetings.
Oh, yeah.
And is one of the most innovative in the workplace as a manager. And it hadn't dawned on me, Kevin, until then that we should stand and have a meeting. It was brilliant. It was so simple and yet so brilliant. It really helped us understand the length of it, what it was for, and get us to the purpose.
Yeah. There's some really good work. A guy named Stephen Rogelberg does a lot of work on what he calls the science of meetings. And one of the things he says that I think is right is we get into a mindset where, meetings have to include everybody. They're scheduled by default to be an hour long.
Ah, yes.
And for a lot of meetings, it'd be well worth including only those who need it. Maybe do the meeting while you walk around. Or
that's even better than standing.
Yeah,
to have walking meetings.
Yeah.
If we can get that more and more, walking meetings for wherever we go, if we can then also break down some of the constructed rules of working that seem to have been created in the past that just have not helped us in so many ways. Certainly one is about our own physical health.
Yeah.
Sitting.
I think we've all at some point sat through an hour-long meeting thinking, well, this could have been an email. Right? If all you're doing is conveying information to me, then just send me a note. We don't need a meeting for that. And when you cut that stuff out, then it becomes more possible to have those 10-minute huddles.
So the right model, just to circle back, I think like the health, just like the H, health and safety, the I and the R and the teams. Okay, very good.
Yeah, and the other key to that is we say to leaders, you have to find your own way to do this, but you need to figure out a way to work it into your schedule too. So that means when I say involvement, I'm not saying schedule a 45-minute planning session. I'm saying take 2 minutes to ask somebody, what do you think we should do? Right? Because managers don't have time. And if we give them a set of tools that requires them to add another 4 hours to their day, that's just not a helpful thing to do.
Yeah. I think the variation too, based on the, what the decision is in it, we have to consider those kind of things. But I do think we probably have many more meetings for those kind of engagements when we could have done in a much more, fluid and easier way to go forward.
Yeah. And so, absolutely. And some you may need, if we're planning out our corporate strategy for the next 5 years, that may need a real meeting. Right? But if we're just trying to figure out, who goes to first coffee and who goes to second, we don't need an hour-long discussion over it.
No. Which is the autonomy, you and I had chatted very briefly about the need or the recognition or the need for recognition for managers and leaders of, humans and our autonomy and to be able to have some control at work. And we have so many little things, not big things necessarily, but the little things that, like you say, who's going to go to coffee, having people help to solve that problem instead of directing them is an easy win for a supervisor.
And we spend a lot of time making decisions we don't have to make that just annoy people. I always say to our executive groups, if you ever find yourself in the position of telling another adult when they can drink coffee or when they can go to the washroom, you've made some seriously bad choices.
That's so true. I use that in our training as well, which is, it seems it's an easy default sometimes. And it's just, and then all of this, it could be that it's thought to be the way we work here when we can recreate so many of the ways we work here.
Yeah, that's right.
And instead of accepting what was there before, if we apply some of these things that we didn't know to workplaces, which is why I love all the research that you and all of your colleagues do, because there's so much more that we can apply so easily to the workplace and improve things. Can you share a little bit about the leadership styles? And we talked about that there's so many overlaps.
Yeah.
Around sort of health, leadership that's health promoting or health oriented.
So there's a big debate right now in the literature about this. And I think inadvertently I might have contributed to starting it.
Good job.
Well, in the area of safety, for years, people have studied the relationship between the transformational leadership style and safety. And then in 2002, with Julian Berling and Kathleen Laughlin, we wrote a paper where we introduced the notion of safety-specific transformational leadership. So it's the same thing. It's just focused on safety. And that turned out to be a really popular paper. And it started, I think, this movement of people doing very specific aspects of leadership. So now I have colleagues who are looking at diversity leadership. There's people looking at health promoting leadership. And the underlying models are all the same. It's the focus that differentiates them. So, was that a good thing or a bad thing? I really don't know. Right? I mean, to an extent, the data tend to suggest that leaders get what they focus on. So if you have a leader focused on health, the employees will report improved health outcomes. And if they focus on safety, you'll get better safety outcomes. But of course, it's more complex than that for leaders, because we want them to promote health and safety and productivity and profitability. And, we want them to focus on a lot of things. And that might lead you to a more general style. So bottom line for me is any model of leadership has to have a concern for people. Mm-hmm. Whether that's expressed in your concern for health and safety, or your concern for more broader issues of health or mental health, or whatever it is, the leader's job is to be concerned with people. So I think to some extent, a lot of the different models are just different ways of expressing that sort of fundamental.
Do they, excuse me, do they have sort of recommended behaviors, attached to each of those models, sort of in the health promoting or health oriented or health? I think there's some other names that are associated with leadership and health in terms of helping to impact mental health and well-being at work.
Yeah. So you get, it depends on the specific model, but people will talk about, the importance of leaders modeling healthy behaviors, right? So maybe introducing walking meetings if you're trying to encourage more physical activity, things like that, and then talking about it, sort of promoting it, and then aligning sort of the workplace around health. So there was I wouldn't say a big issue, but there was an issue there. I worked with a healthy workplace group at a hospital. And one of the things they focused on, I think to their sorrow, was they were trying to promote physical health and better nutrition and everything. But like most hospitals, there was a Tim Hortons, right? And it was cheaper to get a double and a Boston cream than it was to buy a salad for $15 or whatever they were. So that became a big issue. Just because things were out of line, the organization was saying we really value and encourage healthy behaviors, but at the same time, they weren't selling healthy food or things like that. Yeah. So I think there's a leadership role in sort of aligning those things in some way.
How does it show up? So there's a lot of discussion around flexibility, and that sort of the shift from what we might call more hierarchical and sort of traditional leadership styles that, have a basket of behaviors, or maybe it's attitudes. Are there some, so for flexibility, which many employees are looking for more flexibility, and certainly since the pandemic, but way before that, we just, I think as a society, didn't realize we could do it.
Yeah, I think that's one of our big learnings, is how flexible we could be. And in many ways it solves a lot of problems. So a lot of problems around accommodation requests, for example, emerge because individuals cannot do the work in the way that you expect them to do the work.
Mm.
And if we can think about, well, do I care how you do the work, or do I just care that it gets done? And if I just care that it gets done, then why can't I say to you, here are your goals, here's what you need to produce this week, figure it out. Work at home, work in the office, work at Starbucks, work anywhere you want, I don't care. Work 3 o'clock in the morning, work 8 to 4, I don't care how you do it, just get this stuff done by the end of the week. And if you can do that, it gives people almost total autonomy over a lot of sort of big decisions about where they work and when they work and things like that. It allows them to adjust their schedules to suit their own, either their health conditions or their family situation or whatever. I think flexibility is one of the best things that we've learned. It's not about really, I don't think, necessarily, we have this debate about working from home, working versus working in the office versus working hybrid. But if you're working at home and I have key logging software on your machine and I insist you keep your camera on, that's probably not a good thing for your health. And if you're in the office, but I say do whatever you want, figure out how you're going to get this work done, that's probably a good thing. I don't think it has to do with where you are. I think the key is that the individuals get to make a choice.
For managers, the thinking about the value, there's the work itself, and then there's the value of maybe it's the teaming, maybe it is, a manager who recognizes, okay, there seems to be some good when we come together, or is there value? I guess maybe it's not that assumption. It's like asking the question, should I be thinking about how do I structure things for some other goals other than maybe just the specifics of the task or the work?
Sure. And there's often legitimate reasons where we need to come together, whether that's to enhance collaboration or we need to work together on a particular project and we can't do that using technology for some reason. So I get that people occasionally have to come together. I think it's probably less often than we think. And you certainly hear a lot of employees saying, I get a lot more work done at home.
Is there a number? Is there an equation? Like there's, for on average, it's good for employees to, if you can have all of the flexibility, what is a thing?
Yeah.
Sometimes we don't know also ourselves as employees some benefits because we don't know what we don't know. Yeah. And I just think that's kind of the little bit of the conundrum around that.
So we seem to have converged on, 2 to 3 days a week in the office is the ideal.
Okay.
And I think even, when employees don't want to do that and they say, well, I'd rather stay at home 5 days a week, there are some costs to that we've known about for a long time. And the biggest one is, when you're out of sight, you're out of mind. So if you choose to work entirely at home, just bluntly, you may be sacrificing your career. So you want to think about, is that what you want to do? Because when the next promotion comes around or the next opportunity, managers are probably going to look at the people who are around them. And if you're not there, they're not going to think of you for that. So there is, I think, a career element that's more longer term that employees want to think about. It's actually very ironic because all of the data say, when I summarize these data, I always say, what we know is that working at home is very good for companies and very bad for employees. But at the same time, employees love it and they want to work at home, and companies want us back in the office. So it's very odd. But the data say when we're working at home, we tend to work longer hours. We get all the same work done, even if that means we're working in the evenings and things like that. So we have some work-family issues going on there. And there's benefits for the company in terms of, maybe they need less office space or they can repurpose some space or whatever. But at the same time, it's companies that want us back in the office and employees that ones back home. So,
that's very funny. That's interesting.
Yeah. There's an irony there somewhere.
There is definitely an irony there.
Yeah.
What about psychological safety and the trust, kind of the idea of trust in the work? So this, when we have that flexibility, are we, maybe, as you say, we're sacrificing sort of that longer term, career elements, but also familiarity, like sort of what's the role of familiarity kind of and trust, and then,
So any increased flexibility requires trust, right?
Right.
And I did hear, we were doing some work on remote working during the pandemic, and we did hear stories about employees who were working at home, but their employer said they had to turn on their camera and leave it on all day. So literally someone could check in at you and make sure you're at your desk when you're supposed to be at your desk. And we've heard about key logging software and things like that. So now you have the appearance of flexibility because you're working at home, but it's not really flexible. They're monitoring your every movement, right? So real flexibility is, I'm going to trust you to get this work done and to figure out how to do it. That requires a lot of trust.
It eliminates the leaders learning how to trust. Like if you are turning on all these things, I think it just that you're turning all these things. You're not even as a leader or manager pushing yourself to say, even if you have a concern about it.
I think it forces us then to think about what we're doing as leaders.
Yeah. Why are we doing that?
Yeah. And if our model is that we have to keep people under really tight control, that's probably not working as well as we think it is, even in the workplace, set aside when people are working at home.
Yeah.
There's better ways to go about this.
What about the culture, like the sort of the impact on culture when you have an organization that's putting some of these things, they're trying to implement flexibility and also doing these other things that has to have an impact on the culture, or at least the climate, I guess.
Yeah. And that's it's very amorphous, but that's the biggest thing we hear when organizations want people back in the workplace. They say, well, it's our culture. Mm-hmm. And I always think, well, are you saying it's your culture to have people where they don't want to be? Like, I'm not sure what you're saying. But
I want to be in the room with you when you say that. I love that for the leaders who can, who are courageous enough to hear that. That's sort of getting them to think, more deeply, Kevin, about sort of going below the first response almost. It's like,
and I recognize actually that, culture is important and different companies have different cultures. And then the question is there a way we can achieve both goals and have more flexibility and still maintain or even build on our culture? And recognize that if we change something fundamental, we change the way we work, there's going to be a lot of spin-off effects, and some are going to be good and some are not going to be good. So yesterday in the news in Halifax, it was, I think, the Downtown Business Association was asking the municipality to make employees come back to work, to come back to the office, because we need them in the office because that's when they go to our coffee shops and restaurants. And I get that, from their point of view, this is the survival of their business.
Yeah.
And so when we introduce a big change like that, it has implications that maybe even extend beyond our organization.
I think the action for that is to test and try things out and stay curious and sort of question your own sort of assumptions or think through those second order consequences and, what's the ultimate impact, getting a little more deeply understanding ourselves as managers, and then also some of the impacts some of these things have. And that takes some courage and it takes time and reflection.
Yeah. And it may mean we have to back up at some point because we made a decision and it had a consequence that we weren't anticipating. And I don't I don't think that's the end of the world.
Yeah.
I
don't think.
Now we're back to psychological safety, because it should be okay for me as the leader to say, yeah, you know what? I called that one wrong. I made a mistake.
That didn't work.
Yeah.
That didn't work.
And then let's rethink this.
Go to your involvement one, right?
That's
then
right.
Go to the involvement element of the action and behavior and engage in another version of that.
Yeah.
I think that's sort of the cycle, to go back and go deeper instead of saying, well, that didn't work. Let's just, move on. It's sort of, sometimes it's not the idea, it's the implementation. Sometimes it's the implementation wasn't exactly right. Well, sometimes it's the idea, but I think it's to get much more free about testing and trying variations.
And that, I think, is, there's a lot of good work on psychological safety and its importance. And the most important thing we can do is to have that for everybody, not just employees, but leaders as well.
Yeah.
Be able to say, I made a mistake here and I made the wrong decision. Let's rethink it.
Yeah.
And for their leaders to be able to say that and throughout the organization, that I think is really transformative for an organization.
Yeah.
If you get to that point.
Yeah, that it would be a beautiful state. And so I think just continuously improving and applying the newest research and findings that your colleagues continue to do, and all the students, which is awesome. Yeah. Kevin, thank you so much for your time today. You've given so much sort of areas for me to continue to research, which is awesome. So that's the reason you're here. Yeah. And also just the chance, I think, to give some practical advice to managers and more reflection. I think the more time we can think about some of these things and then apply them more practically with the right, so that there are behaviors. Maybe everyone needs an elastic band around their so that it's like, I did 4, being 5, I'm on 5 today. But I think it's, not always having to do everything all the time. It's taking the context that you referenced to and figuring out some things for yourself. And then we can continue to change workplaces for good, which is ultimately for everyone. Yeah.
So thank you. I enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. It's been great. Okay. And thanks to all our listeners for tuning in, and check out the other episodes on the Canada Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast website. But also you can go and watch the episodes on YouTube at the Flourish DX YouTube channel. And reach out to me at 13factors.ca or on LinkedIn. Love to hear your ideas and thoughts and comments about the podcast, and also ideas for the future. Thanks a lot. Until next time.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Canada podcast. To stay up to date with the best content on workplace mental health in North America, subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and join the Flourish DX community at www.flourishdx.com.